morning, everyone. Excited to see you here. We have a great panel, great speakers with us today. We are going to get you very excited about governance this morning. So, just to set the stage for us all, I know that we come together in a very sensitive time. Generally, we are talking about things that are moving across the board. We are talking about geopolitical tension. We are talking about wars. We are talking about climate incidents that are increasing. We are talking about fragmented global dialogue. In this global context, we might be missing one major element, which is about climate in terms of how we govern, how we move things forward, and how we get things moving into action. So we are risking taking climate as a side project as the attention is moved towards the political and the economic lens. So what are we talking about today? We are talking about the reform of climate governance as a system that operates across multiple levels, talking from the multilateral to the regional, to the city, to the country level, and all the way towards institutions. So this year, probably everybody read the headlines. The headlines from across the media, across the board, we're speaking that we breached 1.5 degrees. The fight is already over. We don't need to bother. Now, it goes to no surprise that this is not the first time the media misleads us into one thing, but the framing is absolutely wrong. In terms of IPCC and in terms of the science, we take multi-decadal averages to identify a breach of 1.5 degrees. So scientifically, the fight is still on. In terms of how much time do we have, it is really a narrowing window. But politically, the question is up for an answer. So let's talk about how we recharge and not restore the governance agenda. And how do we align the discussion to accelerate the financial flows that needed to go in terms of building resilience, transitioning, and leaving no one behind? So, to help us unpack that, and I'm starting with my right, I am joined by Dan Wicklum, the CEO of Transition Accelerator and the co-chair of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Board. The Honorable Catherine McKenna, chair of the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero Commitments of Non-State Entities, and a former. In terms of adding to everybody's comments, we always say the H-leg, so we like to add acronyms within this.
That's really awesome acronym.
Yes. And then after that, we are joined by Connor Lyons, partner at Power Sustainable. And last but not least, Jingdong Huao, the vice chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board. So without further ado, and I'm going to go back to you, Catherine, and we're going to start the framing from your vantage point, from a global lens. You worked on setting the guidelines in terms of what global transparency and accountability means. So give us a lay of the land in terms of what do we see globally?
I mean, maybe we got to just go way back, just step back. I mean, often we talk about climate, it's kind of a weird thing. Climate is this little thing over here. It's kind of like gender. We'll just put it over here. We'll talk about it sometimes, and we'll go away from it because we decide we don't really care about it, and then we'll come back. The science doesn't care. The science is just going to keep on moving forward. It doesn't care about our negotiations with provinces or with other countries or trade wars. And so, I mean, what you need to think about this, I go back to first principles, and I go back to, I'm a competitive swimmer. I really was, but I still kind of pretend I am. If you want to do anything in life, you have to have long-term goals, right? These are called stretch goals. And if you think about Olympians, anyone know Summer McIntosh?
Yeah.
Yes, of course, you know Summer McIntosh. If you watch the Olympics, she's amazing and is going to get even better. So she was probably 5 years old, and she's like, I'm going to win a gold medal at the Olympics. And everyone's like, yeah, whatever, Summer. And so then she's got this stretch goal that people think is bonkers. But then what did she do? She got up every day and she did the work. Twice a day, multiple times a day. And then she would get on the blocks and actually be assessed against the clock. And she wouldn't have done the time that she knew she needed to do. So then she'd go back, do more work, innovate, talk to other people, get maybe different coaches, and just continuously doing this to hit the goal. And by the way, I didn't go to the Olympics, I went to Olympic trials, but I went way faster than I did by having a stretch goal of going to the Olympics. So I would just ask that when we start thinking about hard things, we actually are just disciplined about it's long term, but every day you gotta do the work, but you gotta measure it. And so climate isn't, like, sometimes we talk about climate as another thing. Climate is literally a risk. It's a massive risk. We actually have one of my, the experts on my expert group was at Alliance, major global insurer, reinsurer, and he said that climate is gonna eat capitalism. Like, that's not a climate issue, that's like an economic issue. And so this is what it is. Like, when we talk about, net zero targets, like, people are like, that's so woke, or God, that's over. I'm like, no. Actually, in life, you want to do something, you better have a target. And the target is, we got to get to net zero. That's just the science. And the good news is, actually, it's an innovation agenda. We have better solutions. That is the energy transition. We shouldn't be using the technologies that we're using in the 19th century or, the 18th century, or like these old technologies. We're innovating, and by the way, the cost curve, the technological curve, is massive. The costs are going down. So, I'll get into more detail about this HLAG group. I was like, oh my God, climate and acronyms, like, it's literally the worst. But it's really just having discipline. Discipline about disclosure. Disclosure isn't climate-related disclosure, it's actually just disclosure. The first thing you learn about markets is markets only work if you have perfect information. So the disclosure is about having information. It doesn't tell you what you need to do, it tells you what you need to tell. And what are you doing against this? So but the last thing I'll say is, if you go around the world, I was just in Singapore. That's probably why I look so tired, because I'm like so jet lagged now that I'm old. I cannot adjust to time differences. But I'm in Singapore. Singapore is like a technocratic country. So they just look at the facts and the science and whatever. And the head of Temasek, so Temasek is their sovereign wealth fund, said, like, climate is not only a moral imperative, it's a strategic opportunity. And also Singapore will be underwater, at 1 degree. So they're just like, okay, we're just gonna go do things and innovate. And I think this is what we need to do to climate. Like, this whole, like, everyone's getting so political and everything's climate's political. It's not even a political issue, it's just an issue. Just an issue. And it's an economic issue, it's an innovation issue, it's a competitive advantage issue. And I'm very happy that we have a prime minister that understands the issue both from a risk perspective and an opportunity, and we're gonna have to compete. Like, I only like winning, and if Canada wants to win, we better do things differently, because people can put their money anywhere around the world. So if we don't have proper frameworks in place, especially for the folks we want to be trading with probably in the US, California, that's the 5th largest economy in the world, Europe, Japan, Asia, China, but all of Asia, India, hopefully Africa, because we also need to scale solutions there, then we have to go where the world is going. Canada doesn't get to decide the rules, and I know we'll hear from our colleague here about where the world is going and where Canada is not yet, and some of these things are so obvious to attract capital, and also have the discipline to do hard things that will lead to amazing outcomes. Net zero is an amazing outcome because it means cleaner air and cleaner water and better jobs and tackling inequality, but it also, I have 3 kids. That is why I do this, because we're now in real time about what the future will be tomorrow. I was in California. We've seen what's happened with the wildfires there, the next day, and in 10 years, 20 years. This isn't a far off thing. This is a real thing right now, so we got to get with it.
Well, I think, Catherine, you mentioned it very, very well in terms of the rest of the world is moving. Transparency is not something that is negotiable. And I think the best person to tell us more about it is the person that is at the center of the most ambitious global effort to bring all of this transparency to life at the ISSB. And sometimes I feel nostalgic that when the alphabet soup was our biggest problem, I wish that is the problem that we're talking about, but we advanced. So I would love to hear from you, Jingdong. What is the global energy moving in terms of transparency, and where are we now?
Well, indeed. Good morning, everyone. And it's great that we're talking about this in Montreal, because Montreal has a special place, starting with Montreal Protocol in leading sustainability agenda. So I'm the vice chair of ISSB, which is part of the IFRS Foundation, whose job is to create global standards that will bring transparency, accountability, and comparability to investor decisions. And the traditional part was on accounting. That's why the foundation started 30 years ago. And then at Glasgow COP, it was decided that with the alphabetic soup, each of the alphabet meant well, but collectively created so much confusion in terms of when an investor wanted to do something, which standard do I use? Which data set do I use? Are they comparable? So it is recognized that we need to have a global single language when it comes to sustainability, climate disclosure, that we should convert into a set of standards. And that's why ISSB was created. And Canada, Quebec, and Montreal are so supportive. Canada created a coalition of champions and provided a significant level of seed funding. So I'm very fortunate. I'm based in Montreal office. Just to give you a quick report, since our creation in Glasgow, barely 3 years ago, 3.5, we have now created our first 2 sets of standards. And I have to say, the Canadian Sustainability Standard Board immediately ported it into a national set of standards, which are 100% aligned with our international standard. And I'm happy to report 37 global jurisdictions, including one of them called the European Union, that itself represents 27 countries, have decided or on the way to decide to mandatorily adopt our standard through the discipline of regulatory regime and the market discipline of capital market listing, right? Now, these 37 jurisdictions represent over 60% of global GDP, about 85% of global market cap except the US, or 40% with the US, and over half of global emission. It gives me and gives our foundation great hope that we see a tremendous momentum. And as Catherine, you mentioned that Canadian security regulators have decided to pause, right? So it's a mandatory introduction. And I cannot comment as an international standard setter. But what I would like to say is that the other jurisdictions, including the rest of the 5 out of the G7, right? Most of the G20, when their policymaker and security regulator weighed the cost of benefit, they decided on balance, this brings more competitive edge to their companies because providing a high quality disclosure will elevate their information for investors to make informed decisions, right? Now, for Canada, one thing I can observe is that the United States obviously is by far the biggest trading partner. But when you look at the other 9 out of the top 10, right? 8 out of the other 9 have decided to adopt ISSB standard. And even in the US, the state of California has published state legislation requiring companies active in California, whether company headquarters or through trade activity, to disclose climate risks, and citing that if you disclose using ISSB standard, then you are in compliance, right? So this is a decision a Canadian regulator, policymaker have to make. But just to say, the most of the rest of the world have decided this will bring benefit to increase transparency, accountability, comparability, but competitiveness to their companies, attracting global capital.
Well, attracting global capital is definitely the name of the game for climate action. But I like that we said the rest of the world is moving, progress is happening, comparability, climate is an economic issue at its core, but you ended with competitiveness. And I'm gonna go to the person, Dan to my right, the person who has not been saying competitiveness just now, in this political moment, but you have talking and working on Canada's transition and where Canada is to the rest of the world in climate action. So I would love to hear from you in this landscape, in this global governance, in this drive for climate action, where do you see Canada is right now?
Thank you. When we launched the Transition Accelerator, which is my organization about 5 years ago, was purposely launched to take a new approach to try to drive down emissions and address climate change. And before we launched the accelerator, we literally went to change management experts, and we said, like, is the world and is Canada, are we approaching this wicked problem about how to do things differently well from change management theory? And they literally laughed at us, and they said, we're making every mistake in the book. You know, really what we're doing is we're telling people that thou shalt change, you must change, or else you're morally wrong. Or so, you don't change a company's culture by giving people heck. You change by painting a positive picture of the future and motivating them to do things differently. So that's literally what our organization has been doing, and it's through a competitiveness paradigm. So we want Canada to be competitive in the future, but we want to tack on low emissions, compatibility with a net neutral world. So that's sort of really what we do. So in terms of competitiveness, I got 4 quick points I got to make to help frame the conversation, because lots of these folks are better at better positioned to have some of the substance. But the first point, I think, is like, where is Canada in relation to disclosure and transparency? And I think so do we suck. Like, we're not great, right? All of our markets are working against mandatory disclosure. We have a taxonomy that's been stuck in the government of Canada, federal government, for over 2 years without being released. And then we have much of the world, including California and so on, just moving ahead. So, I mean, why do you need transparency and disclosure? So capital can make the best decisions about where they want to invest. So it's just sort of crazy to us to sort of say, we're not going to tell you exactly what we're doing here. But could you please invest here? Like, that just doesn't seem real to me. So we're sort of not really playing by the games of capitalism. Okay, number one. Number two, temporal. A company just can't change its product mix overnight. New sectors can't just all of a sudden flower and emerge strong overnight. These things take years and decades. And for us to sort of think that we can sort of hedge our bets and not change and be ready to change, but boy, when the game really gets real, when the oil consumption does start to plummet, all of a sudden we're going to emerge competitive economy. I think we're sort of kidding ourselves. Like, we have to start doing things now. That's the second thing, is a temporal component. The third is, like, if you talk about competitiveness, we're competing against something, another company, another region, another country. So I just always love to go back to China, right? We've been debating for 15 years in this country the concept of industrial policy. Is it the private sector's job to create the future? Is it the government's job? So we're having this debate literally for 15 years about roles of future competitiveness. Meanwhile, 20 years ago, China literally said, we're going to dominate the world for all the technologies that this planet is going to need to combat climate change. And they've done it. So they're globally dominant in solar panels. They're globally dominant in batteries. They're globally dominant in electric vehicles. We are being outcompeted. So if we're talking about competitiveness, we're losers right now. Like, we're literally losers. And unless we have a very deliberate strategy to switch that around, we're going to continue to lose. Fourth point is role. I hinted at it. Is it the private sector's role? Is it government's role? So if we're talking about just transparency and regs, like, I think it's utterly ridiculous to ask private sector company investors to make investment decisions that will result in them making less money. That's just not going to happen. So somehow, it's the regulators, it's the governments, it's the people that we vote for and hire to take care of our public good. Those are my 4 somewhat probably not controversial points. So over to you.
Connor, everybody's looking at you now.
Yeah.
The person with the money on the panel. So I think Dan put it to you very clearly that we can ask the investors with the money to go in, tackle it. First of all, I would say it, the personal commitments and the voluntary commitments and how you allocate capital without return. So tell us from your lens, very honest, do you think the lay of the land is conducive to support investment in climate action?
It's a great question. I've been thinking, as we've been speaking about this topic, I've been thinking about somebody named Tariq Fancy. And I don't know if folks in this room know who that is. He used to be the Chief Investment Officer for Sustainable Investing at BlackRock. And he came out a few years ago. He left BlackRock in a bit of a huff, and what he was communicating was that investment managers are not going to help us get there. that fundamentally it is a governance question, is a policy question, it's a people question, it's a systems level problem. And over time, I've come to fundamentally agree with them. Maybe I'll start with a few issues that I see from where I sit. So I'm a partner at Power Sustainable. We're a Montreal headquartered investment company, part of Power Corporation of Canada. What we're trying to do is to bring more capital towards solutions and do it in a way that does not compromise the financial objectives and returns that investments typically are seeking. We think we're doing a great job of that, but we're a very, very sort of small fish in this grand pond. So what are the enablers that need to happen, or maybe what are the things that are challenging us? There's three that I would speak about. The first one is I would describe it as fundamental financial stability regulation as being a challenge. We at Power Sustainable often think about insurance companies and pensions and other large pools of capital that are going to be crucial to hitting that $4 or $5 trillion a year that we all need to put towards climate solutions in order to prevent hitting 1.5 or 2, if we've already hit 1.5. Those pools of capital are very challenged to move money into the right places. And one of the reasons why they're challenged is because they are regulated, they are required to hold certain amounts of liquidity on hand if they are not investing in a broad base of securities. So these large pools of capital, insurance and pensions is what I'll focus on for the moment. For every dollar that they invest, they need to hold a certain amount of dollars on the side for a rainy day just in case things go bad. And that's because they have liabilities that they need to pay out to their policyholders or pensioners. In that scenario, they are incentivized. They are not just disincentivized not to do this. They are incentivized to hold a broad base of securities. And from a Canadian point of view, what that means is that you buy bonds that any one of the oil majors issues. You own securities. You lend money to fossil fuel consumption, and it means that as much as you would like to, you are in fact required. You're incentivized to invest against what we're talking about here today. That is for good reasons to some extent, but to Catherine's point, I'm not sure whether we're caught up with the science. And there may be a gap there that's meaning that our large pools of capital are in fact not putting money focused on the future, but focused on today. And I think that's a challenge from our point of view at Power Sustainable. That means that we have trouble convincing folks sometimes to invest in solutions because they're disincentivized against it. The second thing that I'd talk about would be the challenge of taxonomy and communications. I was in a conversation here yesterday afternoon about the fact that climate solutions, investing in climate solutions, it's not an asset class. This is there are different ways to invest in climate solutions, whether it's through infrastructure or we focus on infrastructure and private equity. There's lots of great venture sort of stage companies that are contributing to the solution set. But when you speak to the folks who manage and own the asset owners, they don't think in climate solutions and impact. They think in asset classes and public equities and public bonds and private equity and infrastructure and private credit. So there's an element of talking that language and developing products that look and feel and smell and taste like the way that those asset owners think, and I think that's a second barrier, and having the right language to talk about it is very important. The third sort of barrier that I would speak to is that it's not being asked for very explicitly. We're having a conversation in Canada about where we are going to invest substantial public dollars, and the obvious place, the momentum. It's almost as if it is impossible to step up and say that we should not be substantially investing public money in moving fossil fuels to other parts of the world. And there is an argument to doing that. There is also lots of arguments for not doing that. long-term business case arguments, competitiveness arguments. At $52, $53 a barrel right now, it does not make sense. And I'm not hearing any political leaders make that point. This does not make sense. This is a crazy thing to be talking about. Whether it is or it is not, it's a very difficult challenge for us to face as a country, as a globe. But this point around capital is going to follow where the incentives are. What are the incentives from the regulator? What are the incentives when it comes to communicating with owners of assets who are actually making allocation decisions of where capital goes? They need to be spoken to in their language. And what are the incentives from a political point of view? I think that we need to be a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more honest, and the capital will flow. There are lots of people in investment firms like mine and others that want to make money on this. But if the infrastructure around it, if the governance around it is not very clear, if it's not secure, if it's not predictable, it's going to be impossible to move that capital in the right direction, as much as folks like us at Power Sustainable are trying to do so.
Well, we've laid the land in terms of what is happening globally, what is happening in Canada, and some of the restrictions here. But I would like to take, before we move into what next, I know you have some reflections on the comments from others, and Catherine, I know you have something to come back to. So before we move on.
So it's interesting because it's always like the chicken and the egg. Should government do things and regulate, or should we let business do things? Everyone has to work together. So the problem is we need leaders, and that means you need to be brave. I talked about this yesterday, but look, I was doing carbon pricing. You may know the consumer carbon price. We don't have it anymore. But part of the challenge is like people are like, yeah, I support it. So that might be whatever industry association. I actually forced folks because I created the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and I was like, business, you want in, you got to like put your hand up. And so in government, it's hard, right? Like government is doing a million different things. And by the way, like there's huge expectations from Mark Carney. He's a very smart person, but we also have a very disruptive situation with the United States where 70% and more of our trade is reliant on it. So we got to deal with that situation. And then we got to figure out how we're going to diversify. Now we need to protect our sovereignty, which means investing not just in, massive infrastructure, but like, watching our back in the Arctic, which means watching what Russia's doing. So like, it's pretty complicated. So the reality is we do need business to be working with us. You can't just say, and so I agree with Dan, like obviously governments are the ones who regulate. They need to set the rules. And I remember Larry Fink from BlackRock, I was walking in COP, and so my friend is working for him. He's no longer working for him. And he introduces me to Larry Fink. So he's quite a big guy, and he says, oh, it's Larry Fink. And I was like, oh, okay, hi, I'm Catherine McKenna. And he was like, you're the environment minister. I actually wasn't the environment minister, I was out. And he's like, we are not the environmental regulators, like industry. And I was like, hi, dude, like, what's going on? But it's just interesting, because we always get there, but we need, like they wrote, BlackRock as an example, wrote a letter and just talking to investors and talking about money and why the money needs to move. Like, we do need leadership, because government, you're standing there like trying to do a hard thing, putting a price on pollution. And then everyone's like, yeah, I support it. And then I was like, well, great, go and stand up there. It can't just be Catherine McKenna every day pounding, trying to fight, because I'm a fighter, and then like getting pounded by people who just don't want to do it and are, to be honest, quite frankly, misleading Canadians. Like, we do need leadership on all sides. If you need something, because I think it's interesting, I always learn things. I was like, oh, of course, that's really interesting that we aren't even creating the proper incentives for the transition. And by the way, finance, I will be perfectly honest, the Department of Finance, I'm not sure they actually look at the International Energy Agency's projections. Like, Canada doesn't decide the energy transition. We don't. Like, we got to live in a world, and it's not, we have this product, so we're just going to continue doing it. And if people don't want to buy what you're selling for a whole range of reasons, because it's dirty or it's expensive or whatever, that's just a thing. But I do think we got to work together more, and I think that requires business leaders to step up. Like, by the way, business leaders, I know they come because they come and lobby us all the time. They're like literally anything they want, they're at our door. But maybe if you want other things, like nice things to happen, like regulation that's going to create the right incentives, then you also have to both lobby, but also speak up publicly, because Mark Carney's going to want to do hard things. But if industry is like, yeah, we really wanted that, but no one's supporting it, it is not possible to keep, because you have very loud folks, and we know who they are, some premiers that will just go out and say whatever. And so we're in the disinformation world is very strong. People don't read, they're not having necessarily the news sources. They're providing very, straight up information. So it's just really hard. So I would just say to folks in the room, if you're in this room, obviously you care, please speak up. And if you want something from government, then explain why, and explain why it will support the government agenda. Like, I don't think people are unreasonable. Government is slow. It doesn't always get it. You try to do regulations, you get it wrong, then you have to adapt. But it's only by doing that together that we can work, because we don't, the government has money, the taxpayer dollars, but we're not figuring out the markets and flowing the money ourselves. So I think that is so important, that people actually will support difficult policies, but will also explain why things don't work, but not just you got to change it. That's not very helpful. We're like, oh, you're just doing that because it's just in your own, your own company advantage, or are you talking about this is going to be very good for Canada's competitiveness? We're going to win in the world because we're going to attract more investment. But by the way, this isn't a comment on these folks. They are champions. They are out there, but we just need everyone to be willing to come on stage, because people are like, I got to be careful. I was like, I don't know, the climate crisis, this whole I gotta be careful thing, I think we're gonna have to get over ourselves if we wanna do hard things.
Well, we are going to have to do hard things. That's for sure. But very quickly, Catherine, I just want to follow up on one thing before I hear from Jingdong. So what do you think with that? The dialogue is very important. We said governance is a system. It's not just regulations alone. It's interaction. Transition is not an asset class, it's an entire sector. So just very quickly to hear from you, what does Canada need to do to reclaim that leadership in this dialogue?
Well, we have to just say, the rest of the world, okay, the US is bonkers. I'm just gonna say it. I'm a trade lawyer, it doesn't make any sense. They don't believe in trade anymore. They're targeting Canada. Get over it, folks, we gotta move. And we always say this, I think, Pierre Elliott Trudeau sleeping with the elephant, but that's great, but now we gotta do it, and our allies are doing things, so we need to be more sophisticated in Canada and be like, we wanna do things with California. Oh, guess what? They're actually doing disclosure. Oh, we wanna attract investment from Asia or from Europe. We need to have a green taxonomy, which is so boring. I say the words and I'm bored, but it means rules about what is green. They just need to know. It doesn't mean you can't do investment in new natural gas. It's just not green. That's just not a thing. It's just a classification. So we gotta want to fight. We have to be more ambitious as a country. I'm just let's stop being kind of passive. We do have a lot of regulated oligopolies. Sorry, but I'm also a competition lawyer. We need to just want to win. And we have to, the one thing that worries me is really federalism. I grew up, I went to McGill, and I was actually in the UK watching the second referendum in Quebec. Now I'm oh my God, now we've got Alberta. I was dudes, the rest of the world doesn't care. They don't care about our little woes between provinces. They don't care about interprovincial trade barriers. They're just they don't wake up every day, I want to invest in Canada. So we better make ourselves competitive and not saying, well, in Canada we do this. No one cares. People are it's a global marketplace. They can put their capital wherever, but we now have a unique opportunity. We have a great immigration system. We have talented people. We have a government that is committed with incentives that may be imperfect. We have all the conditions, but we have to be out there, and we have to be loud, and we have to just want to suck up all the capital, especially in the United States, and clean and bring it here. But that's going to require everyone being out there and talking us up, and not the little picayune things that we do here in Canada. I'm just oh my God, are we really fighting over disclosure? We've got the ISSB here, we can't even do disclosure. Can't get a green taxonomy. Dudes, let's move on and actually do the things to bring the world to Canada and create the competitiveness, the jobs, the economic opportunity in the future we want.
Well, we're talking about bringing the world to Canada, and you and I are enjoying being in Montreal as well, so that is good for us. So what would you tell us, Jingdong, in terms of what other things that worked in other jurisdictions? What can Canada learn from the good examples that are seen in other jurisdictions where other engagements provided that conducive environment where capital eventually didn't find a hard decision to go where it needs to go?
Well, indeed, I think in our dialogue with government agencies, with security regulators, a country needs to analyze, is this unbalance good for my country, or unbalance, adds more burden? Take Nigeria, for example. At COP27, I had a conversation with a Nigerian finance minister and told her about what the ISSB standard would potentially bring. And because she was chairing the African caucus, preparing their common position for COP27, she took it on herself in writing a paragraph in the African declaration of their position saying, we encourage early adoption of ISSB standards in Africa, believing this has a potential to unlock investment. And Nigeria, together with Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, a lot of developing countries have seen it as bringing capital, bringing competitive advantage. But of course, there are concerns. Would it bring burden to corporate reporting, right? So this is where a more granular dialogue where we say, the 14 board members of ISSB are composed of practitioners. I was treasurer of the World Bank, and Jorge took over when I left. I knew when you face investors, you sell your green bonds, your sustainable bonds, what investors looking for. So we never designed the standard to be so strict and so high, bar that it causes anxiety that, this will bring liability to me, right? Instead of benefit. We say it has to be proportional to your capability, to your current level of skill set, and you can go, from a starting point to better. So never let the perfection be the enemy of the good, right? You get started. It's a journey rather than in one go you get to where you are. So I think, and therefore, as a foundation, we do a lot of capacity building, partnering with the World Bank, the UN, to make sure there is knowledge transfer to get this done. So generally speaking, once these dialogue are carried out, this is why we have so much, I think about 60% of the 37 jurisdictions are actually developing country and emerging markets. Let me add another element. Catherine mentioned Singapore. Singapore is a country that I admire tremendously because somehow they have very well-ranked capital market, but they bring a lot of innovation in fintech, in AI, in whatever it is. So their regulatory framework is sort of a Goldilocks, right? So they have rigorous regulatory disclosure requirement. Then they have a sandbox that encourages innovation without stymie, things to happen. I'll give you one example. So when the World Bank Treasury issued the first catastrophe bond for the Philippines, protecting the country through capital market on earthquake and typhoon without damaging their budget, right? That was the first transaction in Asia. Singapore said, issue in my capital market, I'm going to pay for the legal cost to unlock this possibility, right? So that proactive government policy encouraging innovation, right, being very deliberate in attracting investment into a jurisdiction, I think that goes to what Catherine said about this relationship between government and the private sector. Last thing I wanted to say very quickly is that yes, in addition to being treasurer, Jorge is now, but I was also the World Bank Group pension fund, right? So investors should not sacrifice any yield because that's their fiduciary duty. Mm-hmm. But an investor can do good and do well together. I'll give you one example. I was a pandemic treasurer when the pandemic hit. Developed countries barely have enough resources to defend them, to help their own citizens. What about the 120 countries that had nothing? And therefore, the World Bank came up with a $158 billion aid package. So as the treasurer and the treasury of the World Bank, we have to go to global capital market to raise pandemic bonds, right? So within 2 months, we issued 2 largest single US dollar bond outside of US Treasury, $8 billion per bond. So when we were telling our investors a story, they of course trust our AAA and everything, but the amount of response, right? Okay, this is a AAA bond that we buy anyway, but this is a global cause that we also feel a responsibility to support, right? So I'm saying that investors also fellow human beings. They don't live in a different planet. They are aware of, development issues, sustainability issues. and under the condition you don't give up any yield, additionality comes in to attract. And therefore, this is what our ISSB standard hopefully will bring in considering sustainability factors and climate factors.
Well, absolutely agree. But I'll add something from my side on fiduciary duty, but it is also a growing and clear and evident and scientifically confirmed that part of your fiduciary duty is to look and integrate that systemic risk that's eroding your capital over the long term. And that's where we looked at the longer term investors. Why are they more active in allocating capital? Because they're looking at what they need to pay, especially for pensioners, over 20 years down the road. So we're talking about where are our pensions now in this room going to come from. So absolutely agree with you on that note. But I like to also probably here pointed to everybody in the room, and particularly when you said about disclosure, accountability, and transparency, and setting the money or taking the actions now. Disclosure is not about a burden. It's about understanding the allocation of capital where it needs to go. It's about telling a story. So if we are critiquing policymakers or we're critiquing politicians or regulators because of their short-term political cycle, we are even narrower. We're looking at it in a one-year reporting cycle. But in reality, it's not a report. In reality, it's a story of how are we transitioning. So with that, and before we open it up to the question, I'm sure your coffee kicked in, and we have fantastic speakers. I'm sure you have questions. To Dan and to Connor. So bringing this all together, we mentioned the tools in the toolbox. You mentioned taxonomy very quickly. We know we have regulations, anti-greenwashing regulations. We've talked about disclosure, and we talked about Canada taking action to prevent that breach, let's just say, of greenwashing rules. Sometimes, if policy is not tailored in the right way, it might backfire. So I would love to hear from you both. What do you think are the tools that are missing that can push us forward? And what tools need to be changed to redirect the direction?
Mm-hmm. I've been stuck thinking about what you said, Catherine, about leadership and courage. I was having a conversation over dinner last night about this. I think that's the skeleton key. In fact, it is. I could make the argument that disclosure is in fact a burden for certain companies. It absolutely is a burden, but it's important. Like there's a role that needs to happen. I think that there are many places where capital can go. If I can put that hat back on, there's choices in every instance. There is a decision made on whether to purchase the bonds you described or purchase other bonds. There are people who are making those decisions. There are people who must understand this. Folks in this room are amongst that group who do understand this, but there needs to be a very honest conversation about the trade-offs that we are making if we are prioritizing the short term versus the long term. And that conversation is only going to happen through political action. It's going to happen through companies and regulators and investors and other people in this room who are choosing to talk about what we're talking about here. Like this is, it's fundamentally, it's not that useful for us to have this conversation in this room if not every single person in this room decides that I am going to find one of my friends who's never heard about this subject, and I am over a glass of wine or whatever going to have a conversation with them about what we were talking about this morning. Like that's, I think, the challenge that we all need to take up because it is systemic. Governance is an overwhelming big topic that we're trying to tackle in an hour this morning, but it's a matter of governance is a description of, it's sort of a bottom-up people kind of question. And so going back to the importance of political and regulatory action, the reason why that's so crucial is because that is a representation of what we're all talking about and what we're all thinking about. And we need to make those hard choices. We need to have honest conversations about whether we should, build a pipeline or invest that equivalent amount of money in other types of climate solutions, but we're not having those conversations because we're not all, going and finding 3 friends and talking to them about it. I think that we're on a more positive trajectory here in Canada than other countries, but it requires us to all do this, take up the work.
Absolutely. We're going to have to make the trade-offs, but how can we make the trade-offs at the least cost, and especially for the most vulnerable? So Dan, probably we are out of time for questions, but I want to hear from you too in terms of what are the tools that we are missing or can use.
So I'll go super quick, so hopefully we can get to some questions. But I think, when you take a look at Canada, if you go back a year ago, Canada was a pretty stable place. It was working for most of Canada. And we can talk about class disparity and income and regional and so on and so forth, but it was working. Well, Canada's not working anymore, right? So I think it's very difficult to drive change when there's this notion that things are okay, or we're on a trajectory to the future that is going to work for Canada. We're not. So it's actually easier to drive change in the middle of disruption. Because if things are in motion, you have to change them anyway. You can actually guide them into future places. So I think there's 2 things going on up here. And I use inflammatory language and pick inflammatory topics on this type of setting to try and sort of push things, to push the envelope. I think we're talking about sort of what's the role of disclosure, and then also what's the role of government versus private sector in what investments to make what future Canada, which is essentially an industrial policy. And I think the concept of industrial policy is exactly what the Carney government got elected on. We're actually looking for government leadership more so than we have probably for decades in driving the country to a very deliberately defined, different, specific future. And so that's really what I'm most interested in terms of the concept of competitiveness, what's going to make Canada competitive, and what's the role of transparency and disclosure in that. And I don't think, there's a risk that, we've been talking about this stuff for a long time. And I think it's even more difficult now to get sort of a private sector government alignment on sort of what we need to do in transparency and in the future. And I think there's a risk that we just sort of keep talking and don't have a whole lot of action. I think it's almost easier for government to act now than it's ever been before because of the world, because basically our sovereignty and economic and physical sovereignty is being challenged. So I think I'm still looking for government to play a much clear, visible, quick leadership role on both of those things, industrial policy and requiring transparency.
Can I make a point? The work that Dan and his team is doing is it's phenomenal, and it is an actor in Canada that uniquely is, it's not government, it's not the regulator, it's not the private sector. It has a particular place of sort of honesty and independence. The work that Catherine is doing to coalesce at a broad base of actors around the world, but then also, to yesterday's conversation, leadership of women in Canada who are taking on this leadership role, and the work that Jingdong is doing to bring the whole system together is super important. I want to say that there is, I think, I'd ask everybody to read. Actually go on the internet today and read about what the Transition Accelerator is putting out. Read about what Catherine is doing. Read about what Jingdong is doing. These are important parts of the system. It's a big collective, but I think that there's a lot of good answers amongst the 3 of them here. And as a private sector investment actor, we depend on that. We depend on the work and the leadership that's happening in those sort of 3 different categories. And so the more that people in this room, the more the people outside of this room understand what those are, that's going to make it easier for folks like Power Sustainable, and we'd really appreciate that. So I'd encourage people go online and read, and then talk to somebody about it.
Go read the Net Zero report. I didn't really get into it. Integrity Matters. It's very short. It has 10 recommendations. It's we didn't get into it, but it's just in a way, it's just common sense about what we need to do with a very clear roadmap. And I wrote it kind of in English, understandable for people. That was the real purpose.
And I'm happy to talk more to people about what we do, but Power Sustainable is one of the best. So in part of the Mutual Admiration Club up here, I think Power Sustainable is sort of right up there too. So
We're not going to fight. We're just going to be loving.
Yeah, that's right.
it's part together. But maybe I'll call this out on me. Part of governance is engagement with stakeholders, and I engaged with the stakeholders on the panel, and we do not have time for questions. But I do encourage you to come up and ask your questions and learn more. And probably Connor said it best, I think, in terms of encouraging you all to read and learn more about each and every one. And I will say to Connor, what Connor missed to say for their role, it's not just, we talked about across the 3 days, we heard about the transition in sectors, not in asset classes, in across for communities, and governance is the same way. We need to have these dialogues. We need to have and talk about trade-offs. We need to have uncomfortable, really annoying conversations with all stakeholders involved. And even if we're talking disclosure, regulation, policymakers and role, the sizable and transferability in terms of what regulations apply to who really matters, and how we approach that is very important. This was a conversation that I cannot get enough of. Who thought it's enjoyable to have a conversation about governance at 9 a.m. in the morning, but with the speakers, it's always enjoyable. So please join me in thanking our very fantastic panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.